Full disclosure, I've never been attacked by a grizzly bear. I've never pitched for the Yankees, never coached the Aggies, and I never lost $2 billion. So why am I here? I think you're kind of listening to the cover band for the Beatles here, but anyway, I don't remember who they were. So I'll give it a shot. Even George reminded me there, why are you talking? What I want to share with you guys is I turned 75 not too long ago. It's hard to believe. And I want to share with you something that's really been important to me. I was at a conference a couple of years ago, and a guy was speaking on a generosity topic, but before he got into it, he said, I'm a little down today because, my great aunt died, and she was so wonderful to me. She was like 80-something. He said, when an old person dies, the library burns down. And I thought about that, and I said, good grief, we're all libraries. And, my folks are dead, my aunts and uncles are dead, my brother and sister are dead. And I thought, who in the world is going to capture that history and all that if it's not me? So I thought, I'm going to write I'm going to do a little autobiography. Well, 1 year goes by, 2 years go by, and doesn't zip. And so we're in this mentoring group with these young guys that Hal and Bill Nath and I have, and I mentioned the fact that it's on my life plan, which we'll talk about later, but I'm not making any progress. And he says, have you ever heard of something called Storyworth? And I said, no, what is it? And they said, well, for like $100, you sign up and they send you an email every week and you answer the email, and at the end of a year they put it all together and voila, you've got your story, and you can upload pictures and all that. So I started Storyworth. It's kind of like learning Spanish with Duolingo. But anyway, I got into it, and then I got COVID, 2 or 3 months ago, where I had like 10 days of nothing, and I got a lot done. So boys and girls, or just boys here, you're going to get to hear kind of a life story. And the whole purpose of this is something I want to give to my kids and grandkids. And it mainly covers my life and my mom and dad's life, but it also gets back to our family history. So let's get started. And I hope this might trigger something in you guys to maybe want to do it yourself, because we all kind of desire to do it sometime. I grew up in Oklahoma. My dad was of Cherokee descent. And so our family was very into Indian culture. And I had an aunt that was an Indian agent. I had another aunt that was a nurse in an Indian hospital. And like I said, in Oklahoma, as you know, it was very Indian-oriented. It was old Indian territory. It turned out, in my research, I had a great-great-great-grandfather named James Clement Vann that was one of the chiefs of the Southern Cherokee Nation, and actually the wealthiest Cherokee in the East, and actually considered one of the wealthiest men of the East Coast. He built this huge mansion, which still exists today and is now a National Historical Site. So that's the good news. The bad news is, in the 1830s, Andrew Jackson became president, and there was a treaty that was made there that's basically confiscated all of the Indians' properties, and they were all shipped off to Oklahoma. So that's how my family ended up in Oklahoma. So obviously we were not big Andrew Jackson fans, but because if it wasn't for him, I'd been a rich Indian going to Emory instead of a poor one going to Kansas. So the thing I will say, though, despite all that history, my relatives, my aunts, my uncles, they all served in World War II. They were very involved. We were Americans. Regardless of what our background was, we were proud of our Indian heritage, and even though it wasn't the greatest about what happened, we loved America. And that's one thing I grew up with. You don't see that today, but that's what I grew up in. I grew up in a little town called Commerce, Oklahoma, which is in northeastern Oklahoma. And if you're old enough and a baseball fan, you know that's where Mickey Mantle's from. He was a family friend, and we grew up with Mickey until he moved to Dallas. He built our Little League Park, and he was always involved. My favorite story was when I was 11, we were opening the park, and this 1957 caramel-colored Lincoln Continental pulls up, and out pops Mickey Mantle, Whitey Ford, and Billy Martin to go to our game. That's pretty cool. And so I also grew up with another great athlete named Steve Owens that later became the Heisman Trophy winner at OU, and we were friends at OU and still are friends. My family was rabid Oklahoma football fans, and Okies didn't have anything else to root for, so we rooted for football. And so in the 50s was a great time to be an Oklahoma Sooner fan. The interesting thing was my dad also went to college in Kansas, not at KU, but in Kansas, and we were big Kansas basketball fans. For all you guys have been accusing me of being dual all these years, I've been dual since I was a kid. And so we rooted for KU and OU. One thing I will share, when I was 10 years old, I had the worst year of my life. KU lost in triple overtime to North Carolina in basketball. There you go, that's for you, Bo. Took us 65 years to get even with them. And then OU had its 47-game winning streak broken by Notre Dame later that year. So that was a tough year for the kid. But Dad and I, our whole family, when I thought about why am I so passionate about sports, is because that reminds me of family. We were always together, and it was all around sports. And my dad and I, until he died, that really held us together. I passed that on to my son Kip, and we've spent a lot of time at OU Texas games and at Allen Fieldhouse, but unfortunately, I think this is going to pass. His daughter went to Texas, his son to Baylor, and my girls kids are all Aggies. So I think the OU-KU connection may be gone. The lesson I learned, and I'd pass on to you, is have a special connection with your kids with something, whether it's an activity, a sport, a trip, or whatever. For Barbara and me, we were season ticket holders at KU at Allen Fieldhouse for 35 years, and we no longer have them finally. But we took every grandkid, all the kids, and some of our good buddies went with us there too. So just do something like that; it'll last you forever. On my faith journey, let me go through my faith journey. I grew up in a mixed religious home. Mom was a Methodist and Dad was a pessimist, and so I went to church. Mom had us all going to church on Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday nights, vacation Bible school and all that. So I grew up and because the main thing back in Oklahoma, and maybe then, was Dad was all for it because he said, that's where the good kids are. I don't want you getting in trouble. So he wanted us to go to church, but he didn't go. After Commerce, I left and moved to Pampa, Texas. Dad got transferred. And so I go from a class of 40 to a class of 500. And that was a huge shock. And that was one of the big pivots in my life. And by the way, the point I wanted to also mention, when you look back over your life, and especially mine for 75 years, you see all these little nuances and pivots that happen to change the outcome of your life. And that was one of them. It turned out at Pampa, I did recover and ended up having a really good athletic career and an academic career, and got a scholarship at the University of Oklahoma in math. My dad never really gave me a lot of advice, but on this one he said, son, I'd like you to think about maybe being an engineer instead of a math teacher. He said, I was a teacher, and he said, you don't make any money doing that. And he said, I'm seeing in my company all these young engineers are coming and taking over. So I switched to chemical engineering, and that turned out to be one of the great things in my life. And I would just say, for us as parents and grandparents, we know the ropes a lot better sometimes than our kids, and I think it's really important giving that advice at the appropriate time with your kids. I then headed off to OU, and just the very first couple of months I get there, I fall in love with a girl back in Commerce. So I spent all my weekends, most of the time, not at OU, but going back to Commerce. And she was a member of a very conservative, legalistic church. And I didn't know those terms back then. I just knew I cared for her. And I didn't care what she was. I was going to be in Commerce. And so we stayed together for that year, and I spent the summer there. And then my sophomore year at OU, I was not in a fraternity at that time. And this thing keeps kicking out. I end up my roommates, I have 3 other roommates. One's an atheist, and the other 2 are agnostic. And I'm I'm not sure I'm Christian, but I wasn't sure quite what I was. And I got hammered. I got destroyed at dinner talk. And so my faith was kind of in shambles, and I decided, maybe I'll go back and talk to this pastor of this church about my life and, these questions I've got. Well, instead of really being encouraged and saying, hey, those are good questions, let's talk about it, he went off on me. He said, son, Satan's working on you. You got to get out of the University of Oklahoma and go to Ozark Bible College. And I know all the Texas people would agree with that, to get out of the University of Oklahoma. But Anyway, and he said, you can't ask God those kind of questions. And I said, well, if he can't handle my questions, I don't need him. And I, at that point, left whatever faith I had. And I said, I'm going to look for the meaning of life somewhere else. Another great pivot happened. So I break up with my girlfriend, and my parents had moved to Coffeyville, Kansas. So that summer I stayed there and met a bunch of Sigma News from KU, and they said, why don't you go to KU? Got a scholarship there, and then I'm off to Lawrence, Kansas. So now I'm back. Now I legitimately go to both schools now, so I can root for them. I ended up, one of the great things about KU, first of all, KU was much more politically liberal than OU. And this was also the time of the Vietnam War, which you all remember was very, very difficult. So at that time, the other thing that KU had, they required every student to go through a class called Western Civilization, the history of Western Civilization, which was a full year of teaching, and you had to go back in the summer to pass this class. It was fabulous. So I learned all about philosophy, all the way from Plato to Sartre. And so it actually was right what I needed at the time, because I had these big questions on life. I ended up, of all things, I decided I was going to become existentialism was what I ended up. For those of you, and Jean-Paul Sartre was kind of the leader of it, and a lot of the French atheists were big at that time, and with what was going on in Vietnam, the U.S. was pretty much going a lot that way. Existentialism means that there is no essence. You're not born with any essence. You just exist. You create whatever essence you have. Life is meaningless. And Sartre's quote was, man is a useless passion, and then you act without hope. So that was it. That was my theory. And I thought, well, okay, I got that figured out. So what does that mean? I guess that means you're born, and I used to say this to shock people. I guess you're born, you live, you die, you rot. That's it. So with that figured out, I thought, religion didn't work, now try this. You start thinking, well, what's next? Well, if there's no God, or if he doesn't really intervene in life, you might as well eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. Good idea. So now let's try hedonism. One thing right before I left KU, in December of '69, some of you old enough to remember, that was the very first lottery. Guess what my number was? 1. I was at a Western Kentucky-Kansas basketball game, and they announced that at halftime, and I was shocked. A week later, though, it turned out I received a medical deferment for some asthma that I'd had when I was a kid in Commerce, Oklahoma. We had such terrible air quality there. It's interesting, when I thought back on it, not only did I not go into the draft at that time, but also the move from Commerce to Pampa probably cured my lungs, because you go from a very terrible air environment around the chat piles and the lead and zinc mining to suddenly West Texas where the wind blows. So interesting, just another little thought that I thought of. So I head off to Baton Rouge, Louisiana with Exxon. It was Humble Oil at the time. And that year of 1970, I start work and I get married. Hedonism is not a good philosophy for either of those. And so, as you know, for those of you old enough to know the 70s, it was when they came up with the term, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, that was the era they were talking about. And especially, you also have to add disco. And by the end of the 70s, and I'd moved to Houston in the process, you reap what you sow. At that time, I had a failed marriage, separation from my kids, my career was stalled, and I really hated my prospects. To top it all off, my mother died at age 52 when I was 30, just in 1978. And then with all of that, I ended up in the hospital for a week or a week and a half with a bleeding ulcer that almost killed me. So you'd think, this is the fruits of all that? I need a mulligan. This did not work. I got to try something different. Well, the great thing is I now go into the third phase of my life, which I call personal peace and affluence. And what that involved, the first thing that happened is I met my wife, Barbara. And we went to Wichita, Kansas. I changed jobs. I went to work for Koch Industries, which was and my dad lived in Coffeyville. So it was a chance to be with my dad, who, after my mom had died. And I thought, I need to start over. But I said, okay, you'd think this is where I'd find God, but I didn't. I said, I'm going to clean up my act, whatever that means. But I got to set some goals for myself. I need some goals. So here's what I want. I want a Porsche, a house on the golf course, and it's got to have an automatic sprinkler system and garage door opener. those were my goals. You got to remember, I'm from Commerce, Oklahoma, and so I start working and I'm making progress, but I'm also decide, look, I don't have any money. I'm going to start investing. So I'm buying silver, I'm buying options, and I'm not doing very well in that either. If anybody invested in silver in the 1980s, and so I remember I'm sitting in my office after work one day, and the boss comes in and he sees me talking to my broker. He said, Kyle, let me give you a piece of advice. He said, if you'd spend the time you're spending on your own portfolio working for Mr. Koch, you're not only going to make more money with Koch, you're going to lose less money with your investments. And from that time on, it really changed the way I looked at life. I really focused more on my career. I kind of parted with a lot of those get-rich-quick schemes and started focusing more on hitting singles and doubles and not home runs. And so that was a major thing. I then got into the marketing and trading business, which it turned out after 20 years of looking for what's the sweet spot, that's where my career really took off. Okay, that's the good news. I'm 40 years old, but I'm sitting there thinking, gosh, I've got everything I said. My career's going great, but I don't feel very good. I'm feeling empty. There's something missing. So now we get into how God works in mysterious ways. You're going to laugh at this, but so I start with, I'll call it religion. It really wasn't Christianity, it was religion. And I go hedonism 1, hedonism 2. Now I thought, what's next? And maybe I go back to religion. Maybe that'll work. So I started studying religions and all that, and decided. So anyway, here's where the first miracle happens, and I call it the OU Nebraska miracle. 1987, OU and Nebraska were both undefeated, number 1, number 2, and had this big game. We always had a party at our house for OU Nebraska. At the same time, I had a couple of buddies that had worked with me in Exxon, and another one that I worked for and at Koch who had become Christians. And they had been wild men. They were running mates, so to speak. And I thought, man, they're too smart for that. What are they doing? And I was so hostile to Christianity. This one guy kept saying, Kyle, you've got to give God a chance. I don't know what happened to you, but you got to give God a chance. So we're watching the OU Nebraska game, and OU's behind at the half. And my friend's talking to me, and he kind of hits me up with the same thing. And I said, tell you what, Chris, OU wins this game. I'll go to church tomorrow. Well, Patrick Collins rips off a 65-yard touchdown, and we beat Nebraska 17-7, and I'm excited. So I go out and celebrate all night with a buddy. Get up the next morning, tell Barbara, get up. She said, why? What are we going to do? I said, we're going to church. She said, why? I said, well, I promised to go to church if OU won. And gentlemen, that was the beginning. So I started going to church, sitting in the back, last one in, first one out, and just listening. And for 2 years, I kind of, career was going well, and I was, still wasn't reading the Bible. I was reading a lot of stuff about Christianity, but I finally said, we're going to join the church. So now miracle number 2 happens. I'm getting ready to go join the church, where you have to go to the classes and say some stuff. I end up signing up for a family retreat. And I tell Barbara, we're going to this family retreat. She said, why in the world are we doing this? And I said, I don't know. Somebody said it would be fun. She said, you realize what we're going to be doing? And I said, fine. I thought, good grief, we're going to be out with all these religious people locked up in a camp for a weekend. What am I doing? So I go out there, and sure enough, I'm finding out, boy, there was something these people had I didn't have. And I knew I was a poser. But I thought, okay, maybe if I can just get through this weekend, I'll escape. Well, we get to the last day, and the pastor he tells us all to go out for 15 minutes and just be quiet and listen and talk to God. So I'm out there, and I'm looking at my watch, and there's people crying and all that, and I thought, man, I don't feel anything. But, so finally, I remember my only prayer was, and I never knew how to pray, I just said, Lord, I don't know if you're up there, but let me have it. That's all I said. I go back in. And so, they're doing testimonies. And by the way, this is kind of what you're hearing. And I'd never heard a testimony before. And there was some amazing stuff that had happened actually right in my row. And I'm thinking, man, maybe I ought to say something, but I was really uncomfortable. I thought, man, I was going to say, well, you're giving me a lot to think about, that kind of stuff, but get me out of here. Suddenly the pastor says, he said, we got time for one more testifier. And he quotes Matthew 10:32 and 33, which says, Whoever acknowledges me before men, so will I acknowledge before my Father in heaven. Whoever disowns me before men, so will I disown. And it was amazing. It was like an arrow went through my heart. I shot up, and instead of saying what I thought I was going to say, I just started weeping. I've never had anything like that. And what I realized, several things I realized at that time, my hostility towards God was based on that pastor and that discussion we'd had 22 years ago. And I'd put his face on Jesus. That's what I'd really done. And I might ask you, I don't know where you all are, but whose face are you putting on Jesus? That's who I had put on it. The other thing was I knew that I was instantly changed. I didn't know what to, but I had been changed. And a friend of mine who was a fellow running mate, he said, when I became a Christian, he said it was the second most miraculous conversion since Saul of Tarsus. So that gives you a little bit of an, we won't get into the detail. I know Ed wants names, but we can't, it's being videoed. I can't give names. So now, let's get now to some, we've gone through 40-some years, and now let's look back over the last 33, and I want to share some life lessons that I've learned and I thought about that I want to pass on to my kids and grandkids, and hopefully to you, about two things. One about faith and also about work. First thing I found out is all those years I was running from God and had nothing to do with him, he was pursuing me. That's one thing I learned. And I went back and looked at some old writings I did, and even then, I think when I was running and mad, I was still looking for him. And so, and so many little, I call them miracles along the way, whether it's the bed at OU. By the way, one thing for humorists, when I became a Christian later, I made a comment, and when I was up at Austin giving a talk on this, I said, I'm the only guy that Barry Switzer ever led to Christ. So I actually got a chance at an FCA thing several years later, and Tom Osborne was our speaker, and Tom, of course, you know, was the Nebraska coach, and I'm not sure he enjoyed that too much, but so I am living proof that even Barry can convert somebody. Well, he didn't. He got it started. But God speaks to us in many ways. The other thing is when I became a Christian, mine was pretty radical. Sometimes they said, you know exactly the instant, the second you become a Christian, like I do. There's others who say it takes place over a long time. It's kind of like when somebody says, well, when did you go bald? Well, you know, it's over a period of time. So I don't know where you are, but that, for me, I know the day and the minute and the hour. But I was off center for 2 or 3 years because I wasn't, you know, I started reading the Bible. I started trying to understand. I had all these, I was a big skeptic, science guy, philosophy guy. And so I was trying to say, how do I make sense of all this? But I spent 2 or 3 years at least, really, in fact, I spent a lifetime doing that. But I got a mentor that started meeting with me. He was a physician from Wichita, really a well-known physician. And we spent 7 years together. He was a navigator every week for 7 years. And we're still very close. And he really helped. He had a great sense of humor. And I wore him out with questions. And he helped me really integrate my whole life around my faith in all aspects. So if you don't have a buddy or a mentor, get one. And then also when you get mentored, go mentor somebody else. And so we'll talk about that later. The other thing is I got a little dour there for a while because I wasn't sure what I was supposed to be. What do Christians do? And it turned out, I think, after learning all this, I realized God restored my sense of humor, you know, maybe without the F-bombs, but he restored my sense of humor and a chance to really, and he also gave me a heart for my friends that didn't know him. So that's how that changed. You know, I still deal with doubts sometimes. I think we all do. That's just part of life. But I always look for how God intertwines everything, from science to philosophy to work to everything. And so I try to live an integrated life, which leads me to what's the big lesson I got. There's 2 or 3 big lessons. One is when Greg Brenneman talked, he talked about, I don't know if he called it a life plan, but I started about 20 years ago with this, and I would really encourage this for everybody if you don't. Be as strategic with your life as you are with your business. And so what that means, he breaks up, we went to this retreat and they broke up life into 5 factors. It was like faith, family, finance, fun, and fitness. Those are the 5. So we went out there and he says, we had a guy facilitating this. He said, I want you to go out, find a place, for about an hour and write down over your lifetime, what would you like to do in each of these 5 categories? Did that, came back. And he said, now, go back for another hour. What are you going to do over the next 3 years? So you go start prioritizing, you think of that. And so we're thinking, doing a good job. Then he comes in and he hits us with a big surprise. What if you had 6 months to live? What are you going to do? And that was a real eye-opener for me because we don't know how long we got to live. And the point he got out of this is it's very important to live a no-regrets life. Most pastors will tell you on deathbeds, people are just thinking about what they didn't do. And I said, I don't want to do that. So this was a plan that helps me every time to review to how do I live my life in a way so that if I get taken tomorrow, I got no regrets. So that's something I really work on all the time. And we teach this to the guys that we mentor. As far as how to live your life, I think it's St. Francis said it best, preach the gospel every day, when necessary, use words. You know, you may be the only Bible somebody ever reads. And so what my hope is that I don't disqualify myself by not really representing Christ well. You know, sometimes I might have a little trouble at golf. I might screw up a little bit there. But the thing is to try to really honor God in everything you do. The other thing I learned is your mess becomes your message. The people that God has used the greatest, a lot of times have been hurt the most. And so whatever your mess was, it's probably going to become your message. And in my case, it's discipleship. I mean, I think back to what happened to me with that pastor. If I'd had somebody mentoring me and all that, I mean, who knows, I might have avoided all that. And so that's why it's so important to me to meet, especially I like meeting with young guys in their 30s. I'm not a young kid guy, and I'm probably not even a high school guy, but I really like dealing with guys that are upwardly mobile in their 30s. And so I've already spent a lot of time with them, and we got a good group now that we're working with. The other thing that this is somewhat humorous, but also very true, it's really important, I think, as a Christian to be absolutely excellent at whatever you do, whether it's being an artist, whether it's being a CEO, a street sweeper, whatever you are, be excellent. And sometimes I think people miss that. And I'll tell you a little story. I don't know if this is true or not, but I love it because it talks about it's not enough to be a Christian, you also need to be good in whatever you do. There was an old man that was a mentor, and suddenly they had this juvenile delinquent, and he was always getting into fights, so they put him with this old man. And so the old man says, well, I'll tell you what I'm doing. I'm going to take you to a boxing match. He takes him to a Golden Gloves event somewhere, wherever it is, and so they're sitting down watching, and the first bout's getting ready to happen, and the bell rings, and this guy comes out, and he crosses himself. And the young kid said, what's that? And he said, what's that do? He says, nothing if he can't box. So it's important that it's one thing to be a Christian, you need to be good too. So I just want to put that up. The last thing I want to mention is Randy Alcorn has written a lot of books on money, possessions, and eternity. He wrote a little book called The Treasure Principle, which is really good. But he has this thing I'll share with you. He says, live for the line, not the dot. In eternity is a line. And of course, the Bible teaches that we're all spiritual, eternal spiritual creatures. And just for maybe 60, 70, 80, 100 years, we've got this earth suit on that we're going to be here. But live for the line, not the dot. And that just says, instead of storing up stockpiles here on earth, send it ahead to heaven, through your good works. And so that model has really influenced Barb and me to try to be conduits of God's blessing to people. And I know a lot of people in here that do the same thing. But generosity is a lot of fun. And that's what we do. Last thing on career, I think I'm doing okay. If I'm to finish on career, I'm going to take you some highlights and most of my career I'm going to share with you is really stuff I learned at Koch, and there's a few of us in here like Mike that we went through this together. But the first thing I just want to tell you, it's really critical to understand how you're wired and find the job that fits your wiring. I can tell you for 20 years, it took me 20 years to find my spot. Anything you can do to help your kids or even in your own jobs or whatever you're doing, try to get connected to your wiring. Because I will just say, if this is the requirements of the job and this is your capabilities, you want it like this and not like this. So that's an obvious one. Let me tell you, there's two things that at Koch, Charles Koch's he's certainly the most brilliant guy I ever worked for. And there was two things. He was very much a free market person. And I remember when we were putting together the management system called market-based management, which I think is now called principle-based management. I read this book, Human Action by Ludwig von Mises. Now, I'll be amazed if anybody's ever read that. It's kind of the Bible of Austrian economics, but he starts off with one thing that is I've never forgotten. He says, for human beings to act, three things need to happen. First, they have to have an unease or a sense of discomfort. The second thing is they have to visualize some state that would either ease that discomfort or eliminate it. And the third thing is you got to have either an expectation or the faith that purposeful action can take you from A to B. If all three aren't present, nobody acts. And that is a really wise analysis that helps you also in business strategy, marketing, and all that. So really, if somebody's content, they don't move. And so, we typically are always looking for contentment, but in most cases in the market, it's discontent. And as you know from one of the big things in Austrian economics is for innovation and all that, it's what we call creative destruction. So understanding those concepts were really important to me, and we applied it it's a general principle to apply it all the time. The other thing was Charles spent his career trying to figure out if nations and civilizations that flourished and advanced in education and healthcare and let's just say financial performance, what was part of that? And he boiled it down to 5 categories that we called our toolkit. And so when we analyzed any business or any system, we checked these 5 points, and these are really important. One is vision. You got to first have the right vision and make sure it's shared. Secondly, he called it virtue and talent, and that's both the quality of the people you've got from their virtue and also their talent. One of the things you have to watch is if you have high talent and low virtue, it could be a big problem. That's when your companies get in trouble. Look at the Bernie Madoff. So it's really making sure you've got the right virtue and talent in the company or the system you're looking at. The other one's decision rights, which is based on economics of property rights. You got to really make sure that people in your company who have the best decisions, who have the best knowledge, make the best decisions. They have the rights to do that. So you have to make sure that you don't have places where there are no decision rights. The other one's incentives. You can have all those other things right, but if your incentive system's all messed up, it's not going to support that. So that's got to be tied. And then the last thing, which is really getting more important now with technology, is knowledge systems, the ability to share learnings with everybody so you continually can learn. So those 5 systems are ones that I use that system. We call it a toolkit. Anytime we solved a problem or tried to address a problem. Now, I think the one thing I'm going to cut short a little, but I just want to summarize. I like pithy statements that I can remember. And so I'm going to share 3 of them that over my career really meant a lot. And most of these really relate a lot to business, but particularly trading. Life lesson number 1, it's better to be on the outside of a good deal wishing you were in than inside of a bad deal wishing you were out. That was told to me by an old gentleman, Emmett Craig, when I decided to go out of the refining business into trading. Never forgot it, and boy, is that true. And I think you all know that. Second one, this was in Charles Koch's office. When you'd go in for a meeting with him, he had these little red hots. And he had this little sign that says, never confuse a bull market for brains. That's another one. We see all kinds of things now, like bubbles and all that, but keep that in mind. And then the third one was, and this is, when I used to have employees who say, man, our competitors are so stupid, they're doing this, they got to be losing money, or you hear anything like that, or the market's irrational. You remember the quote, the market can stay irrational longer than you can stay liquid. And so I will tell you, in all of those things, those are really wise counsel. Obviously, if you're going to buy an asset, it's a pretty illiquid thing. So the main thing we did at Koch that I thought Charles was outstanding at, most of us would go in there selling something. And as soon as he smelled we were selling, we were in trouble. So he would start going out, he would basically take us to the mat, talking about, well, what if this goes wrong? Or what if this goes wrong? And suddenly we all started learning, maybe we ought to spend as much time on figuring what could go wrong as what could go right. And I think that helps avoid a lot of sorrow, I will tell you that. So that would be the one thing. The other thing in trading we had a very successful trading company. We spent most of our money on analysis. But the thing we also did is we were very careful to stay in liquid markets. I like liquidity. I like liquidity in my financial, because if you're wrong in a liquid market, you can get out. The worst thing is being stuck in that deal you can't get out of. So that's for peace of mind and all that. I think the last thing I want to share, at least on economics before I close, is Thomas Sowell is one of my favorite authors. And he wrote a book called Knowledge and Decisions, among many others. But it really has to do with political economy, and this applies to business, though, too, where you're looking at very complex systems that the government deals with, whether it's climate or poverty or you pick it. And according to Sowell, he says, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And I love that quote, because I think in all life is too complex. There's not just a one-size-fits-all. It's really important to understand the trade-offs and the second-order effects as you think through any business decision. So to close, the last chapter here I'm calling Retirement and Death. How about that? First of all, I really don't think retirement is a biblical concept. I mean, I know expirement is, but I don't know about retirement. I don't remember anybody retired. And one of the things that I've learned is, and when I advise young people, first of all, I go back to look in the Bible. Early on in Genesis, the word that's used for work is the Hebrew word abad, A-B-A-D. You know, it means to labor. It also means, to serve. It also means to minister, but it also means to worship. And I believe that God intended work. Even though sometimes we've got thorns and thistles, he intended this to be a way to work, to honor him. Maybe this later in life after we retire from for-profit, maybe it's in the ministry world or nonprofit world or whatever, but ultimately I think we're most human when we're working. So I pass that on. And when I talk to young guys, somebody will say, well, I want to retire when I'm whatever, 45, 50, 55. Seems to be getting younger. I said, well, I don't look at it that way. I said, why don't you, and I didn't learn this until after the fact, use your first career to set up your second career, then use your second career to set up your third career. So I'm now in my second phase of life. I retired at 57 when we sold our business to Merrill, Lynch, and Loews. And I've been on boards and consulting, and I've loved it. Now I'm 75, and I'm aging out, so to speak, in the public market. So now I'm thinking about what's phase 3. So now I'm going to focus much more on, besides ministry, also private companies and all that. And I just love being engaged in work. So that's for me, and I don't know what it is for you. So my last thing, I guess, would say, guys, I said, I would really encourage everybody to get your house in order, whatever that means for you, and to have a no regrets life. What a great thing that would be. And there's 3 areas. First of all, I'm going to tell you the story of St. Francis, and I'll close. St. Francis, my second quote from him, he was out working his garden one day, and somebody came up and said, St. Francis, if you knew the Lord was going to take you this afternoon, what would you do? He said, well, first I'd finish planting these potatoes. And so the point is, his life was so much in a no regrets phase that he was just going to finish what he didn't say, gosh, I got to go call so-and-so and apologize. I got to go get this DAF started. I got to do this. He was ready to go. And that's my goal, is to try to get things set up so that if I get called tomorrow, punch a button, it's done. So 3 things. One is focus, first of all, on your faith. Where is your faith? And I'll just mention Pascal's wager here for some people, which I've always loved. Pascal was a math guy in game theory, really excellent in that. And what Pascal said was, look, he had his buddies. He was a wild man, then he became a Christian, and he's trying to figure out, how do I talk to my math buddies? He said, so he comes up with this wager. He says, it's a 2x2 matrix, and on one of them is outcomes, and the other one is performance or decision. He said, if you think Jesus is who he said he is, and you're right, home run. If you think Jesus is who he said he is and you're wrong, kind of a null set. I mean, I guess nothing. On the other hand, if you don't think Jesus is who he said he is, and you're right, once again, nothing. But you don't think Jesus is who he says he is, and you're wrong, big problem. And so his point was from the payout was not that you become a believer, but the point is it worth investigating that? So I would say if you don't know, investigate. If you know, go deeper. Secondly, restore relationships. I've seen this in so many people that hold grudges. I don't know where you all are. Settle grudges with anybody. Have nothing left so that if tomorrow you get called, there's nothing you need to do. And the last one is kind of get your financial house in order. Get you a will and estate. Take care of figure out what you want to do with your kids. Figure out what you want to do with ministries and other gifts. And of course, leave a little extra for the University of Kansas. And so get that in order. Folks, that's it. 75 years and 40 minutes.
Well, we've got just a minute or two, so you can't sit at Kyle's feet and hear all that and not have a question or two. I'm telling you. And I'll let you guys think. We have just a minute or two for a question or two in a second. I'm going to start with one.
Sure.
Okay. So tell us that you're kind of hold that still.
Oh yeah.
You, to my estimation, you're sort of in a legendary small group of men that gathers weekly now too. Tell us about the role just in sustaining the things you've decided some things are valuable and important, but it's easy to have mission drift in life, just like an organization or company. So tell us about the role of sort of community in your life and how that functions for you.
Okay. One thing I didn't say is you need a posse. Because if somebody goes off by themselves, that's when an animal gets picked off. So you need a posse, and that's what we've got as a posse. Greg Brenneman, and then Hal and Bill Nath and I have been together for 10 years. We meet. It's become a little less frequent lately because of all the travel Greg's got. But ultimately, we meet together, and Bill and Hal and I meet every week mentoring guys. So it's been terrific as far as we're able to share. Prayer requests, we've walked through, each of us have gone through a big issue, whatever, over the last several years. And it's great to have somebody that you can just unload on and be vulnerable with. We're not trying to impress each other, and so that helps a lot. Now, don't get me wrong, we do talk a little Baylor and Kansas basketball and a few other things too, but ultimately, there's a friendship that we have there that really keeps us focused. And it's also around life, not just faith. It's around business, it's around career, it's around kids, and so it's just nice to have somebody. And finances, we do that together.
That's right. Great. Anybody out there got a question for Kyle? Yeah, right there. Carl.
Yeah, I got a question just around work and business. I'm not quite as old as you are. I'm getting there, but just thinking as a young man now, and focusing on business and life. How should you engage that with your faith now to make an impact right now where you are?
It's a good question. Well, one thing I didn't tell you, guys, is when I made the worst business decision in my life, this is back about 20 years ago, I was stuck in one of those bad deals, and it was miserable. And I remember, at one point I was just asking God, get me out of this. In fact, I said, Lord, are you calling me into ministry? I remember that. Are you calling me into ministry? Well, I didn't hear an audible voice, but here's what I heard. I heard was, Kyle, number one, you're already in full-time ministry for me, number one, where you are. Secondly, you need to honor me, but the way you handle this well. There'll be another time to retire, but it's not now. So so I would say the answer is you can honor God in every position you are. You can, with the way you handle employees, with the goals you set for your company, maybe the way you choose. And some guys I know, like RTI, I know, where they not only are a great for-profit business, but the way they also serve the community and serve their employees. So I feel like as a Christian, we need to have the best companies in the world, or to be the best employees in the world. So that's the way I've looked at it.
Good. All right, maybe one more. Yeah, right there.
Excellent talk, sir. I appreciate your time sharing it. What's one thing, if you could go back to 25, what's one thing you would do differently if you had the chance?
I wouldn't have struck out with the bases loaded at the bottom of the seventh against Borger. I believe what instead of something I wouldn't have done, I think I wished I had had a mentor. You know, my dad was a great guy. I love my dad, but he didn't disciple me at all spiritually. I wished I'd had a man in my life at that point that could have helped me there. I think that would have avoided a lot of issues. Yeah. Wouldn't have an interesting story, but I think I would have avoided a lot of issues.
You wouldn't have a mess, it becomes a message.
I got a lot of messes. So.
Hey, how about another big thank you, Ty?